everyone. Welcome to the xAPI cohort. This is actually week 6. Hard to believe it's week 6, but it is halfway through. And today we have developing a data plan case study of a scenario-based learning experience with Sarah Mercier and Wendy Morgan. But before they get into it, I'm going to share a few additional slides with you. First and foremost, Learning and HR Tech Solutions in Orlando, April 23rd to 25th. Last discount this Friday, March 8th. $100 you can save. You can look at some of the things that are on there that are directed toward the xAPI audience. So if you haven't registered, please register by Friday to get that discount. We have a new checklist about creating authentic scenarios, and I'll be putting the link in when I'm done speaking. It's a free download. We do these checklists, and they're really helpful for a lot of folks. And then lastly, if you're not part of the guild, I would encourage you to join. The membership is free. You can become a member. We have publications, we have webinars, they're all free, all kinds of opportunities for you to have a lot of professional development for free. So I encourage you to join. And of course, this is a 12-week cohort. If you've joined us from the beginning, you know how everything works. We have project teams in Slack. We have these weekly sessions. We do record and we do post them. If you are just joining for the first time and aren't sure what to do, you put some questions about xAPI in the hashtag main Slack channel. If you have questions about the cohort itself, about the emails, the dates, maybe you can't get into the Slack channel, just message me here in AirMeet, or you can email me, and my email address is down there. All right, so let's get to it. So Wendy Morgan, Sarah Mercier, they're going to talk to us about developing a data plan case study of a scenario-based learning experience. And I'm going to stop sharing, and Sarah will begin sharing her presentation. I will be off camera, but I will be here.
Thanks, Karen. All right, y'all, let's get this party started. So Wendy and I are here to share a project with you today, but specifically, we're going to be talking about how we developed a data plan for a project. I know Sean talked to everyone last week about creating a data strategy. What we want to share today are some key takeaways from what do you do when you set up a data plan for a specific project? What are some of the things you might consider? And what are some of the key takeaways that we find are most useful in putting together your data plan? And we're going to share this from the perspective of a project that we worked on for a scenario-based learning experience. But we are both under NDA for this project, so we're going to give you enough to hopefully provide some context for you. But the good news is that the actual project is probably way less important than what we're going to show you today, which is really exciting. So I will start off by sharing that, as Karen mentioned, I'm Sarah. I am the CEO and strategic consultant at Build Capable, and my team has been working in xAPI for many, many years, and we're also running one of the cohort projects. So I hope we can give you an update on that by next week. So Wendy, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Wendy Morgan. I am a senior implementation specialist at Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I can't even say all of that without taking a breath in between. We have been working with xAPI, using xAPI with a variety of projects for many years because of the unique context that we work within that I've spoken about in this venue before.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Wendy. And more on that in just a moment, actually. So our project, just to give you a little bit of background or context for what we were working on together. So Wendy and I were working on a project for teen parenting skills, which is not challenging at all. But the challenge that we were trying to address in this project was to deliver some existing training that had been in a classroom setting but we wanted to be able to support parents who couldn't attend that training for a number of reasons, to be able to fit this training into their schedules and practice some of the skills that were part of that course. The solution that we were putting in place, that we were responsible for developing, was a web-based solution, and it had to be mobile first. They had to be able to access it through their phones. The client that we were working with really wanted game-based, scenario-based content, which made the scenario-based content made a lot of sense for this project. And I'm teaching these skills through stories. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. But our goal was, could we demonstrate that this learning experience was going to result in a measurable improvement in these parents' skills? And we had to be able to capture that data, because if we didn't, then that project would not get funded any more after that engagement. So we wanted to make sure that we were successful and that we could demonstrate that content was successful in moving the needle. And it was for an external audience of learners. It could be parents all over the US. So here's what we're going to share with you today in regards to that project. 3 pieces. So when we got together to develop this data plan, so Wendy was responsible for putting together the data strategy and working with my team to do that, as well as with the subject matter experts and the client. And so my team was responsible for building the solution and making sure that the xAPI statements were sent and the data plan was executed. So the 3 things that we want to share with you in this presentation was, 1, how did we determine what we needed to track? And then 2, how could we demonstrate that we were able to meet our objectives? And then 3, which I think you'll find interesting, is what data protocols did we use? What was useful about our data approach and why? So those are the 3 big topics for today. So we'll start with how you determine what you should track. I'm actually going to ask you all in the chat, does anybody have any idea how do you think we decided this? How do we know what we're supposed to track for this learning solution? Any ideas? Ooh, Sarah's asking a question. All right. When I tell you the answer, you're probably going to be surprised. This is something that you probably already know. So how we determine what we should track is going right back to basics, y'all. We decided what we were going to track based on our learning objectives. And so if you have designed training in your career, you know that you have to start with good learning objectives. You have to know what you're trying to do, or you're just giving people content. So if for us to determine whether or not we'd made any kind of measurable change, we had to figure out what we were trying to do. What are we trying to accomplish? And we did that through writing measurable learning objectives. And, oh, I just saw a chat pop up. For some reason, this did not come up. Okay, awesome. Yes, Lauren, exactly. Learning objectives. Yes, Sherry. Outcomes of your scenarios. Absolutely. So Wendy, I'll turn it over to you to talk about our learning objectives for this project.
Yeah, so we were working with an evidence-based program that's well known in the US, and they already have very specific things that they teach parents and some very clear goals of their program. So we had to kind of go back and forth with them about the learning objectives quite a bit, because they did have a measure literally all of it kind of mentality to begin with. And we really had to pull them in to say, okay, we are going to measure all of it, but why? And when we measure all of that, what is it going to mean? What are we going to know after we look at that data? What does that mean to us? So we went back and forth and we came up with 7 different learning objectives, I think down from 23. Is that?
Yeah, it was a little bit challenging because we were working with a client that didn't quite understand the purpose of learning objectives. So it was really helpful for us to work with them and help them understand why we were putting learning objectives together, and the purpose for them, right, was to determine, like, at the end of this, what do you want people to actually be able to do? And, not just know, because some things, if you are able to do it, then obviously you know it. So you don't have to write a knowledge objective for every single performance objective. It's kind of a given. And I know this is not a session on learning objectives, but Wendy's absolutely right. It was a lot of collaboration to cut this down.
Well, and I think it was actually really helpful on both ends to have that collaboration, because we were able to see how they grouped things and what that meant to them. And they were able to group things and see that they grouped together as well. So it was actually quite good. It was an interesting experience. And I think there was frustration on both sides at the beginning. And then as it came together well.
Yeah, for sure. And so, as you'll notice here, we have objectives everywhere from, can you identify how to track your teenager's behavior, to parent traps that you might get stuck in if your teen does a certain thing or you respond to your teen a certain way. And then there was a whole group of objectives around different strategies, prevention strategies, to prevent a teenager from getting emotionally engaged negatively. And then there were objectives around routines that we were having them practice and strategies that we were having them practice, different approaches that they could take and skills that they could apply in these parenting strategies. So there were several learning objectives, but to Wendy's point, it was really helpful for us to determine what were the different behaviors that we were trying to address in this learning experience. All right. So how do we demonstrate that those objectives were met? Well, we went and we designed our storyboards to address those learning objectives. And so everything that we designed in this learning solution tied back directly to, are we having them practice or demonstrate one of these behaviors, one of these skills? Now, I won't belabor the instructional design process, but for our purposes today, it was really important that we made sure that for every one of those learning objectives, we had relevant practice activities that would give us some data around to what extent someone understood and could apply a given behavior strategy, based on whatever that learning objective was. So, Wendy, talk to us a little bit about this first chart that we have together.
So this is just a sort of a screenshot of one of the pages of a larger data plan that explained how we would be measuring each one of the learning objectives. This is learning objective number 4, which was practicing the routine for managing emotions when your teen's emotions are escalated. So this is really about management strategies and the particular routine that they wanted to teach parents to go through when they've got an overly emotional teen on their hands. So there were several different interactions that tied back to this learning objective. One of them was a scenario-based choice making. So when presented with a situation, are you going to make the right choice in the routine? Another one was presenting certain ways that parents responded and identifying which part of the routine that was. And then there was another piece that was really just asking them, how is this working for you in your real life? Because it was split up into several sort of sessions. We wouldn't expect everybody to take everything at once. And so as they went on, they were asked to reflect and indicate how this experience was shaping their own interactions with their own children. So you'll see in this table, we've got the parenting strategy, the objective on the left, and then the storyboard scene, literally this was done in Articulate Storyline. So this is like literally which screen in Articulate Storyline we are going to be collecting this data on. And then the ID approach, this is the instructional design approach. So how we are translating the learning objective into learner experiences. So which learner experiences are the learners going through in order to demonstrate that learning objective? And this is really an indication of where instructional design and data strategy come together. Because in order to have a good data strategy, you have to have your instructional design aligned with your learning objectives so that you know what you're measuring, right? So we've got the learning objective, the slide where the interaction is taking place, the different approaches, and then the different variables and the way that we are going to be collecting that data across those screens for the purposes of those 3 types of learner experiences. And then on the very right, we've got which pre-post data types that this data should be interacting with according to essentially our theory of change for this project.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to break this down. And from a development perspective, from my team, what this helped us do is it helped us when we're implementing and writing the statements to capture the xAPI data from Storyline, in this case, we were able to map all this back through these variable counts and set up our statements in a way that reported that data back up to a learning objective. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. So essentially, the learner, as they're going through this learning solution, they're going through scenarios, they're making decisions, and along the way, we're using different variable counters to figure out what paths they're taking. And those counters are increasing. We knew the max number of correct or paths that we wanted them to take. And then we were able to capture a count of what paths they did take. So it gave us an opportunity to kind of see how people were implementing these strategies and what decisions they were making along the way. We also had a couple of points in this experience where we did track like correct and incorrect information. We did track, to Wendy's point from earlier, some anecdotal data. Like, how are you applying these strategies with your children, right? So those didn't have right or wrong paths or answers. It was capturing data that we needed to know about how those parents were applying this with their kids. All right, so let's show you what this ended up looking like and where this went. So this gets into data protocols. So how do you make all this happen? Where we started with our learning objectives, we created activities based on those learning objectives. Then we said for each activity, this is how we need to track this activity to make sure that we're reporting that data back on that learning objective. So how did we set all that up? Well, we started in a program called Airtable. If you've heard me speak in this cohort before, you know how much I love Airtable. It's really just a fancy way to, it's a database tool, and it's a fancy way to set up content. So that's a good question. So I'll address that in just a moment about where the course is housed. So whenever we set up this data, we wanted to make sure that we had a way to maintain whether it was it had been met or not. So let me actually share one other screen with you. I'm going to just share this full Airtable because it'll be a little bit easier than a slide. So in Airtable, we had the ability to say, okay, this is the name of the activity. And you might notice that it's LONA, LO2, LO1, LO3. That's learning objective. So we actually gave our activity ID name in our xAPI statement. We named these activities in alignment with the learning objective that they mapped back to. So I could say this activity was tied to learning objective 3A1, and all that was mapped back in this data plan. So we're able to see which learning objective it tied to for a given activity. This is just our checklist to say that we tested it and the statements came through correctly. But we can see which section of the training that it's in. So you're able to notice like where it was at in the training. We mapped out what verbs we used. For this one, we consistently used answered all the way through because we were using context fields to give us more information. But we've got what variable names we used inside of storyline so that we could count out those variables in our xAPI statement. You've even got the variable value, whether it was a counter or, binary true, false, turning it on or off. And then we had the learning objective. It was tied to the purpose of collecting that data. So this is our full data plan for this course. You've got what scene it was in the storyboard, so in our design documents, and you've got the actual project slide that it's in storyline. So I can map all this back. And so from a developer's perspective on my team, we could implement the plan that Wendy put together. Well, I guess we all worked together on it, but that Wendy definitely spent a lot of time figuring out how to map all this back. And we were able to then execute on that and make sure that everything was consistent in one place. So this particular content was launched. We had this hosted on AWS. And it was launched out to provide that information to these users. During the pilot, we used Swarm Cloud for some testing just because we needed to be able to capture some data for this, for some of the pilot users, because the folks in the pilot were actually paid for taking this course. So they actually had to go through and collect some data so that they could pay folks. For the ongoing support of this project, it's hosted on AWS and we serve it out. We collect the actor data we have an HTML page that we've set up to collect the actor data on the front end. So my company actually has a tool that develops launch links that captures the actor data and ties it to the content. So that's done separately now. It's not done through an LMS. I'm not a fan of learning platforms for things like this at all, especially when you have an external audience, because I don't like people having to create and maintain user accounts, because that's a whole other set of issues. Okay, so let me go back over to our presentation. So when we were developing this out in Storyline, let me just show you briefly a couple of screenshots of what this looked like executing it in Storyline. And give me just a moment because I'll have to navigate back over to my page since I switched. So in here, all right. So here's a screenshot of one of the variable counters. And this one was the variable for asking to help. And the ask help variable was tracked back to a related learning objective. So all of this mapped back to the plan, and we were able to set up that variable counter. So as you went through a scenario, every scenario where a selection tied back to that strategy, we added a counter for that variable to say they made this choice in this scenario. And it's giving me a counter for how many times they applied that strategy through these scenarios. Then later in the training, when they came to the end, when they were through all of the scenarios and they were wrapping up, that's where we launched our xAPI statements and we gave the counters. And so we said, okay, here's an xAPI statement that says during this activity, here's where our variable end up for ask help. And then I was able to collect that data in the LRS. And we were able to see for every single activity. So here in the center, you've got all of your activities. I can see how they responded to a given activity, and it mapped back to that learning objective specifically for that strategy. So all of that's mapping back to that air table that you noticed. And we're able to export all of this data, and then you can visualize this however you want. So for this activity, we did not set up the visualizations in, this is Veracity. If you all have probably seen Veracity already in this cohort. This is Veracity's LRS. It doesn't matter what LRS you use, but you can export this same data and visualize it in whatever tools you use. I believe they used BI or something like that, Wendy, but I'm not sure. I can't remember what
For
they
the
used
visualization tools.
Yeah.
They didn't even get that far.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
they could have done all kinds of really cool stuff, visualizations with this.
Yeah, they could have used that though.
Yeah. So this was able to track all this back. So just taking a look at the comments, you were asking, it means that the data plan will be based on the type of technology you'll be using to host the course. You design it the way you did. You can design, it doesn't matter where you host this. As long as it's not blocking xAPI data from coming through, you can host this wherever you want. You could host it on, if you have a learning platform that allows you to use xAPI data, you'll get the same thing. As a matter of fact, like I mentioned, we had this, the pilot group is in SCORM Cloud. You're going to get the same stuff in the LRS and SCORM Cloud that Rustici has. It's going to be the same. As long as it's a conformant LRS, you're going to get this data that will look the same in all of your LRSs. It's just, pick your LRS of choice. the part that was, but the part you have to do, it doesn't matter about the LRS or the hosting or technology so much as it does, can you set up your statements in such a way that allow you to get this data in the first place? And that's where the data strategy comes in. You have to be able to say, here are my learning objectives and here's how we map it back. Now, this is a pretty complex project. Like the point Wendy made earlier, we had more learning objectives than we probably should have for this particular project. And we probably would have done some things a little differently had some different decisions been made up front. I say that as a word of caution to you. As you're designing your learning experiences, think about what do you actually want them to be able to do with this information. Can you set up and write your learning objective to say that? Here's what I want them to be able to do. Here's my outcome. Here are the different objectives that meet that outcome. And then create your activity that lets them practice that thing so that you can collect that data. And you don't have to collect data in your learning experience, right? You can collect data back on the job, like however you want them to demonstrate it. And that's opening a can of worms. I recognize that for how you do all of that. But just making sure that your activities are set up in such a way where you can get that data and that you can map that back to your objective. So just from a very basic perspective, when you're putting together scenarios in your training, can you write your learning objectives to say, here's what these choices actually mean to my learning objective, right? Can you report out data for that? Because in scenarios, things are very rarely right and wrong in life. Usually you have a few different right answers and one that's probably not a good idea, or some answers are better than others. So could you, instead of saying things are right or wrong, could you say the person took this kind of path as opposed to that path, and start to use approaches like this where you can use variable counts or, turn different variables on or off and report out that data in your xAPI statements to be able to connect that back. I also want to acknowledge that if you aren't familiar with working with variables and some of this is new to you, I know that might feel like there's some ramping up to do. And that's why this cohort is great, to start to practice playing with some of these things. So what I would recommend doing in our wrap up would be to first practice writing more measurable learning objectives. Instead of saying the person will understand this thing or they'll learn this thing, what is this thing that you're actually wanting them to do? Are they identifying? Are they practicing and making choices? Like, what are the different things that you're asking them to actually be able to do? And then build your activities around that. and then send your xAPI statements to tie back to what actually happened in that activity. And my big learning from this project was actually name your objects tied to your learning objectives too. It makes your visualization so much easier when you actually have, learning objective 1 in the activity to say like this ties to this activity. And it really makes all that, like tying all that back together later, much easier. And Wendy, I'll turn it over to you to see if there's anything you would add on top of that as well.
Yeah, I would just say, in an ideal world, you write the learning objectives first, and then you design the learner experiences or the learning experiences to the most ideally tap those learning objectives. But sometimes you're going to have to retrofit your data too, where you don't get to do that. And in that case, you still need to align what's there with the learning objectives for that experience, that course or class or whatever it is, the best that you can, because you have to put together a data plan if you're going to be collecting data. Otherwise, you just end up with a bunch of data that you don't know how to interpret. If you can get your data aligned, even if it's not ideal, you have something that you can show. And then I just want to go back to the point about technology or how you're hosting it and say that within my role, we create training exclusively for external audiences. So we're never creating training for internal audiences. And I'm just going to 1,000 times asterisk and star this, don't create the need for accounts and logging into a particular platform for external audiences, because it just creates an enormous amount of barriers and trouble. And you just don't have to do that if you're using xAPI.
Yeah, I love that. And I also love, Wendy, you made such a good point about you can still collect everything. So if I showed you their LRS data, we collected lots more than what we had in our data plan, but we were able to filter out the stuff that we wanted and visualize that data because of how we structured our statements. So we didn't use common things like progressed or experienced that were going to be sent by default by storyline. So we stayed away from stuff like that. When you set up your xAPI statements, stay away from verbs and structuring your xAPI statements in such a way that it would get muddied with other default stuff that goes through with those tools. So that's one other big thing. And I noticed that Mary was talking in the chat about like how you set up your learning objectives, like what kinds of verbs you use and how you write those. If you write something like understand, you can't measure that. Like that's not, I know that there are a lot of people that say, you don't have to write learning objectives. Learning objectives are not useful. Bloom's taxonomy is silly. And what I have to say to that is care less about, the pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy or whatever, and just write your learning objectives for what you want people to do. Think about them being performance-based. There's an entire session that we could do on learning objectives, but I would say following like Kathy Moore's action mapping and thinking about starting with what you want the outcome to be and working back from what are the knowledge and skills people have to do in order to meet that objective, really helpful. I like learning outcomes. Yeah, whatever, like you could say performance-based learning objectives, you can say learning outcomes, you can say, terminal and enabling objectives, like whatever jargon you want to use is fine. What matters is that they are measurable. So however you're writing what you want something to do, somebody to be able to do, you should be able to read that objective and say, I know exactly what someone should practice in order to demonstrate they can do this. I have some ideas, because if you're too vague, then you end up with content dumps of information, right? So super helpful. Share some sample xAPI statements then that demonstrate how you tie them to the objectives. Brian, you might want to say more about that. So do you want to, what I probably could do is, let me see if I can pull up the LRS real quick and I can show you. Brian, are you asking me, do you want me to expand one of these so that you can see the full statement? Is that what you were asking for? Because the way we tie them back to the objectives is that the statement itself, the learning objective is in the statement. So it's part of the activity ID. Yeah, it's right here. It's so right in front of you on the screen now. We had each one of these. So in the activity ID, the activity itself is named, part of the activity name is the learning objective. So LO3B is learning objective 3B, and the name of the activity is strategy effective D. And so in the storyboards, all of the activities are named. We used this naming convention to say, here's what this activity is named, here's what this activity is named. So if you're going through a scenario, every scenario choice has an activity ID that's named back to that learning objective. Is that helpful for clarification?
Slide 13 might also be helpful again for that too, just because it breaks it down and how it was reported.
Yeah, I see. So there's your full statement. ID numbers 2. Do you mean for the slides themselves? So everything, all the details are in the full data plan. We tied it back. We knew what it was because we named the object IDs or the activity IDs. Or I guess it's the object ID technically. But yeah, it's in the ID itself. Okay, cool. All right. So hopefully we got just nerdy enough for this session to give you some new ideas for how you can tie your data plan for a given learning experience back to your learning objectives. And here's some information for Wendy and me if you want to reach out afterwards. I mentioned that we do, I have a project in the cohort right now that is completely self-paced. So if you want to go check out the spring project with Build Capable, there are step-by-step instructions for you to actually go set up a project on your own, step-by-step. So set up an LRS, set up your xAPI statements and some HTML content, and send your statements and visualize them. So definitely check that out. You can do the whole process on your own and send some of your first statements with no authoring tools, paid authoring tools needed. So definitely check that out. All right, Karen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Wendy. And I don't think you violated your NDA, so I think we're good, hopefully. If you would stop sharing just a moment. And this is a perfect segue into the next portion of this session. And the next portion of this session is to get the status updates. So we did hear from Sarah and her program partnership team and what they are doing. And let me just, oh, wait, there we go. Here we go. So team updates. All right, so we're going to get into that right now. And I have invited we have all the teams here listed, and you can go and view them in Slack and see what they're all up to. But we're also going to do some updates right here and now. You heard Sarah's. And the next one we have is from Bill. And this is Team Novice Coders Overambitious xAPI LRS Visualization Pipeline. Ha! And Bill, if you want to go ahead and turn on your camera and microphone and give us an update, because we had a small conversation earlier today, and I think it's really fascinating, and this will give you an example of how cohort works. So take it away, Bill.
Hey, how's it going? I guess I'm being heard. I'll go for it. Sorry about the really long Buckminster Fullerish title, but yeah. So quick update. A bit anticlimactic, but first experience with xAPI. So I jumped right in, created the team, and going through the first few meetings, and also being in attendance with a few other teams' meetings. Essentially learned what some best practices might be for the cohort for xAPI, and essentially after going through with a weekly cadence, now taking it over to more of a asynchronous. So right now I'm in the process of documenting the project plan on GitHub using the projects tool there, and also getting the overall scope statement set up for people to take a look at and experience the project at their own pace, and then having the new kickoff meeting for the project about 5 or 6 weeks late, but restarting and kind of setting up a new iteration basically. So I'll just end it there.
All right, and there is no such thing as late here in cohort. Even if this is your first time in joining, you can start a project right now, because that's how cohort works. So thanks so much for that, Bill. And if you can go ahead and take your camera off. I'm just going to go through a couple other things that I have here. So I do see another team. This one also has a long name, and you can see that name there. And I didn't see a lot of activity, but that's the description. So if you're interested, go look for that and join that team to see if you want to be a part of it. Another one here is Team Frobo, or I believe that's how you would pronounce it. And it's early childhood profile of gifts and occupations. So perhaps Wendy knows about this, but this was the description here. It does have some traction. It does have some project in there, and there is some discussion. So go and join that team and see what's up there. And then this is the description for the project create minimal xAPI send retrieve. There is some looking like there's some action in that team. So look at what they want to do here. And it's a pretty interesting minimalist way. Now, Learning Dojo is our team with Jeff Batt. He's one of our program partners, and Jeff updated with this here. So what they're going to do is they're going to have a video and a script, and they're going to build the storyline project with the placeholder videos. And then once they get their video with the script, they're going to put it into storyline and track it and gather those xAPI statements. So a lot of things going on with that particular team. And of course, here is another program partner, and that is with Torrance Learning. And you can see here what they're going to do is they're testing all different kinds of LMS to see how xAPI support is in there. They've done, I think it is 7, and they're going to have an article about the results. So if you don't see your LMS in that group and you want to do something with it, join the group. Join the group and test out your LMS and see how it looks. It's going to be, and I can't wait to see the article, because that'll be a great resource. And this is a way cohort adds to the community and how you can add to the community. Another program partner, xAPI Beginner Spring. And if you've been here before, you understand this is run by 2 ladies who took the cohort last fall, who were beginners. And they created their own ways of exploring xAPI through working through some projects with some things. If you join that, you are going to get a wealth of information, just like our other program partners. They are taking you through some very beginner things, and they are meeting. And as you can see, they have 2 meetings coming up, one on the 10th and one on the 12th. And they're seeing how people are interacting with the information they're putting in there, because theirs is also asynchronous and giving you information and going, okay, here, go watch this, go look at this, go try this. And then they talk about it and answer people's questions. So if you are brand new, there is a group for you. You'll learn a lot. And then, of course, this is another program partner with Jason Haig and a bunch of other folks as well. Meg Fairchild, I believe, from Torrance Learning as well. So they're doing a lot of KPI. And what they have in their channel is there's some Google Docs. There are recordings of the meetings they've had. And so if you're interested in defining these KPIs, you want to see how that looks, then definitely join that group. It's very active. Now, I have nothing on this slide, but this is the team rising to the challenge with xAPI. And as I was looking through that channel, I could see there was some problems with perhaps sending some xAPI statements from the RISE course. And so this particular group, this team, is looking how they can do that. So if you're interested in that, please join that group. This is dealing with Epic and healthcare. And yeah, so I will, Heather, I'll answer your question. It's in the Slack channel, the Build Capable, and I have it here, and you heard Sarah talk about it, and she's going to talk a little bit more about what's going on with the team next week and show us some actual data, because they are collecting that data, and they'll be able to share it with us. So everything is in the Slack channel. And if you have not joined the Slack channel, then it should have been in your email or in the confirmation page when you signed up for cohort. But if not, you can just message me and I'll get you that link. I'll also post it. However, if you don't see any of those and you're like, I have something in my head, it's week 6. Is it too late? Nope, not too late at all. Not at all. Go ahead, start your project, work on it. And what you do is describe it. And then in #main, put the name of your project, which would be #team. And then whatever you're doing, put a description in the #main in Slack, and see who else would like to join you in this project, because this Slack and this cohort is all about you, all about your learning, because as we were discussing earlier, you have to practice this. It's not something that you can just, sort of osmosisly, if that's a word, learn. You do have to practice. And we have given you a number of project partners where you can go in and learn different aspects. And so we encourage you to do that. We encourage you to look in there. We encourage you to start your own project. And with that, I am going to end our session today, and I will put the join link for Slack in the event feed, which is not this session champ, but it's the event feed that you will see outside of this room. And then you can join the Slack and see what I've been talking about. Anyways, thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to Bill for giving us his team update. Really appreciated your time today. And I hope we have more people to talk about their projects next week instead of me trying to talk about them. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good week.